My name is Emma, and this story took place in 2018 when I was 24 years old. At the time, I was living alone in an apartment on the third floor of a building. Across from my building, there was an identical structure. My downstairs neighbor, Sophie, was someone I had gotten to know quite well. One evening, while visiting her apartment, she confided in me that she had an obsessive ex-boyfriend who had been threatening her. At the time, I was dealing with a leg injury, so I had to use crutches to get around. It was getting late when we suddenly heard someone racing up the stairs, followed by a loud, aggressive knock on the door. Sophie decided to open it, and as soon as she did, her ex-boyfriend lunged at her. I screamed as the two of them fell to the floor. He began strangling her, and in a moment of desperation, I grabbed one of my crutches and struck him on the head. I yelled at him to let go of her. He got up, glared at her, and said she was lucky I had been there. Then, he stormed off. We immediately called the police, but when they arrived, all they said was that there wasn't much they could do. The system failed us that night. Sophie ended up staying at my place for safety. About 2 weeks after that terrifying incident, I was sitting in my living room. Since I had just moved in, I hadn't installed blinds or curtains on the windows yet, so they were exposed. I glanced over at the building across from mine and noticed a light on in one of the windows. I could clearly see the silhouette of someone standing there, staring directly at me. An uneasy feeling crept over me, so I moved to another room and turned off all the lights. Less than 5 seconds later, the light in that same window went off too. Over the next few days, this pattern continued. Whenever I turned my lights on, the light in that window would come on as well. And whenever I turned mine off, theirs would go out too. I was growing increasingly paranoid and scared. To get away for a bit, I decided to visit a friend for the weekend. Now, one thing about me is that I suffer from extreme anxiety, and one of my habits is to triple-check the door lock before leaving the house. I'm certain I did this before leaving. However, when I returned home, I found the door unlocked. I panicked and called the police. They came, searched my apartment, but didn't find anything, so they left. Still uneasy, I left again and this time recorded myself locking the door and testing the handle 3 times. I went back to my friend's place, but the fear followed me. The next day, when I returned home, I found my door damaged, with visible boot marks as if someone had tried to kick it in. I called the police again, and this time they filed a report. They advised me to stay with a relative for a while. My door was replaced, and after about 10 days, I returned to my apartment. Fortunately, nothing else happened after that. I installed blinds on the windows and a security camera at my door. 2 months later, I decided to move out for good. To this day, I'm almost certain it was Sophie's deranged ex-boyfriend trying to get back at me, but I can't prove it. I'm just relieved to have left that place behind. This story took place last summer. I live alone in a small house in a neighborhood where the houses are very close to each other. I know most of my neighbors well. The house to the west of mine had been up for sale for a while, and someone had finally bought it. I saw that a middle-aged man had moved in, but I didn't know much else about him. Over time, I began to notice that the man seemed somewhat unsettling and hard to pin down. He always had a stern expression on his face and rarely left his house. When he did step outside, it was usually just to stand in his yard and look around or to collect his mail. I tried making small talk with him a few times, just to be friendly, but he always seemed uninterested and quickly ended the conversation. Most of the time, I respected his privacy and figured he just preferred to keep to himself. Then, one night, I woke up at 3 a.m., feeling extremely thirsty. I went to the kitchen to grab some water, and as I did, I noticed my neighbor standing outside between our houses. He appeared to be pacing back and forth, which struck me as odd, especially in the middle of the night. A moment later, he went back inside his house, only to come out again less than a minute later. That's when our eyes met. He looked genuinely startled to see me watching him and quickly hurried back inside. I felt uneasy about the whole situation but eventually brushed it off and went back to bed. The next day, I had mostly forgotten about the strange encounter and didn't see him at all. But the following night, I woke up again at 3 a.m. This time, I wasn't particularly thirsty, I just happened to wake up. I glanced at the clock and then lay back down, hoping to fall asleep again. As soon as I settled in, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from my window. Sitting up, I listened more carefully. The tapping persisted, followed by a much louder thud. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside my window, partially obscured by the blinds. Whoever it was quickly took off, disappearing into the night. I searched the house, peering through every window, but I didn't see anything unusual. It took me a while to calm down enough to go back to sleep. The next morning, I went out to my yard, hoping to find some evidence of what had happened the night before, but I came up empty-handed. After that day, I never saw my neighbor again. He must have left without anyone noticing because a few months later, I saw a "for sale" sign in front of the house, and I knew that the man who had been living there was gone. The house had been vacant for months by then. I'm convinced it was him outside my window that night, but I have no idea why he was there or what he was doing. I lived alone in an apartment in the city. Almost on the same day I moved in, strange things started happening. I think it was on the third or fourth night that I heard a loud knock on my door around 2 in the morning. When I opened it, there was no one there. I looked down the empty hallway but saw no sign of life. I was intrigued but tried not to think too much of it. The next day, I found something odd on the floor right outside my door. It was just the cover of an old magazine. The image on the cover showed a man's face, but his eyes were cut out, and there was a large red X over his face. That disturbed me. I thought it might have been a sick prank by some teenager. In the following weeks, strange events continued to occur. I would hear knocks coming from the other side of the living room wall at random times. Sometimes, I would receive knocks on the front door in the middle of the night, but I never found anyone when I opened it. Additionally, strange letters started appearing in my mailbox, things I definitely hadn't requested. During the day, I occasionally saw neighbors coming and going from their apartments. The man who lived next door seemed like an ordinary young adult. One day, as I was leaving the house, I saw something that made me suspicious. He was near my door, and when he saw me, he quickly retreated into his apartment, slamming the door shut. He was holding a magazine or something similar in his hands. This led me to believe that he might be responsible for the strange occurrences. I decided to confront him. I told him about the strange things happening, mentioned the noises I had heard, and the fact that I saw him near my door. He denied everything. I asked if anyone else lived with him and if that person might be responsible. He said he had been living alone for years and didn't appreciate being accused of such things. Before slamming the door in my face, he even insinuated that I might be going crazy. A few minutes later, I heard a distinct sound coming from the wall shared with the man's apartment. I was so upset that I ran over and started banging on his door, demanding that he open it. However, there was no response. After a few minutes, the door of the apartment across the hall opened, and a woman in pajamas came out, looking like she had just woken up. She asked what I was doing. I explained the situation, and she looked at me with concern. It was then that she told me the man next door, whose name was Pedro, had left town the day before. He would be away for a week. I was shocked and didn't know what to do. I apologized for waking her up and went back to my apartment, feeling a chill down my spine. After that, I decided it was time to move out. I stayed in the apartment for a few more weeks, and the strange events continued until about a week before my move, when, mysteriously, everything stopped. Today, I'm relieved not to live there anymore because those events still give me the creeps. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and last year, I moved into my first house after living in an apartment for a few years. The house was older and located in a quiet neighborhood a bit outside the city where I worked. I was excited to have a front yard where I planned to plant flowers and a backyard patio to enjoy sunny days. The house had 2 stories, 2 bedrooms, and 2 bathrooms. On moving day, while my parents and a friend helped me carry boxes and furniture, a man from the house next door watched us. He was an older man with a somewhat eerie appearance and introduced himself as Mr. Carlos. Although he seemed a bit intimidating, we declined his offer to help as we were managing fine. He then stepped back and sat on his porch, watching us as we worked. The next day, after I was settled and alone at home, I was in the living room watching TV when I heard a knock on the door. I looked at the clock and saw it was almost midnight. Peeking through the window, I saw Mr. Carlos at my doorstep, waving at me. Since he saw me through the window, I felt I should answer the door, even though it was late. I opened the door, and he asked if I was enjoying the TV. I told him I was about to go to bed and asked why he was knocking so late. He said he wanted to invite me to dinner the next evening as a welcome for moving in. I really didn't want to go, so I said I was busy the next night, although I actually wasn't. He seemed disappointed but agreed that maybe another time. To be polite, I said maybe another time, and he left. After turning off the lights and getting ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The fact that he knew I was watching TV and that he had knocked on my door almost at midnight was really unsettling. The next day, I went to work and then out to dinner with a friend. When I returned home around 7 p.m., I took off my shoes and started walking toward my bedroom. At that moment, I heard a noise coming from the hallway near the kitchen. There was definitely someone inside my house. I heard footsteps approaching, and not wanting to wait to see who it was, I ran outside, not bothering to put my shoes back on. I ran to the car and, once inside, quickly reversed out of the garage. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw my front door open and Mr. Carlos running back to his house. I immediately stopped the car and called the police. I sat across the street and waited for them to arrive. When the police came, they went to Mr. Carlos's house and confronted him. He admitted to breaking into my home and was arrested on the spot. Since then, I haven't had to worry about him anymore. A few months later, someone else moved into the house next door, and my life returned to normal.